The letter sat on the table for 4 days before Harlan Voss mailed it. He had written it on a Wednesday in the last hour before the fire burned down, with the wind doing its usual work against the north wall of the farmhouse and making the sounds that a man alone on a valley floor either learns to stop hearing or never does. Harlan had stopped hearing them years ago. He was good at not hearing things. It was one of his more developed skills, though nobody was left around to confirm it. The letter was not long. Harlan was not a man who spent words the way he didn't spend anything else. Carelessly. Every sentence he set down on paper cost him something, and so he chose them the way a careful farmer chooses where to plant in poor soil, one at a time, testing the ground before he committed. He had addressed it to the Greenvale bonding house in the border town of Ashenmere, whose notice he had found pinned to the board at Dalton's General Store sometime in October. The notice was small and plainly worded, which was what had caught his eye. Harlan distrusted language that worked too hard. A notice that needed 3 paragraphs to say a simple thing usually didn't trust the thing it was saying. The notice read, Greenvale Bonding House, Orc women of working character, seeking frontier partners. Arrangements made with discretion. Fair terms. That was all. No promises of beauty or devotion, or the particular domestic fantasy that other such notices peddled like bad medicine. Just Orc women of working character. He had read it 4 times, which was 3 more than he usually gave anything, and then he had folded it into his shirt pocket and not looked at it again for 6 weeks. Before we go any further, this channel is brand new, and every single subscribe makes a real difference. It's free, it takes 1 second, and it means more stories like this. 1. Hit subscribe, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and let's build this together. Now, back to Harlan's kitchen table. That was September. By the time he sat down to write, it was November, and Amos Creighton had been dead for 31 days. He had not counted deliberately, he simply knew, the way a man who lives by seasons and light and the angle of shadows on a fence post knows things without trying. 31 days since the search party had found Amos in the snow on the North Ridge, 400 yards from his own door, one hand still reaching toward the cabin he had never made it back to. 31 days since Harlan had stood at the graveside in Millfield, while the minister spoke words that the wind took before they landed. 31 days since Sheriff Briggs had put a hand on his shoulder and said something that Harlan had not quite heard, because he had been listening to the wind instead. He had heard Amos's words later, though. Not Briggs's. Amos's words from 6 months before the accident, spoken at Harlan's table over rabbit stew and bad coffee on a night when Amos had been talking and Harlan had been listening, which was how their conversations worked. You're going to die alone on this farm, Amos had said. Not with cruelty, with the blunt factuality of a man who had known Harlan Voss for 9 years and had long since stopped softening things. And nobody will know for 3 days. Maybe 4. You'll be sitting in this chair for 4 days before anyone thinks to ride over and check. Harlan had said something dismissive. He couldn't remember what. Amos had laughed. Amos laughed easily and often, and poured himself more coffee and let it go. He never pushed. He said the true thing once and allowed a man his dignity. But the thing about a true thing said by someone who knows you is that it doesn't leave. It finds a corner of the mind and sets itself down. It doesn't trouble you every hour, but it is there when the house is quiet and the fire is low and the dark outside is pressing against the walls. 4 days, maybe 4. Harlan had been alone on the valley floor for 7 years. He was 38. He had 40 acres of decent soil, a house that didn't leak except in 2 places he kept meaning to fix, a barn that held 3 horses and a milk cow, and a root cellar better stocked than most families in Millfield. He had 9 books on the shelf above the fireplace, including a volume of poetry he had read so many times. The spine had cracked and been repaired with hide glue. He had everything a man needed, except the thing Amos had pointed at. He wrote the letter. I am seeking a woman of small build and quiet disposition, he wrote, suited to the demands of a working farm in a valley that does not reward softness, but does not require hardship beyond what a careful life provides. I am not a man of elaborate conversation. The work here is physical, and the winters are long. I can offer shelter, provision, and fair treatment. I am prepared to pay the bonding fee and travel costs. He read it back once, then added at the bottom in smaller letters, as though hoping it might not be noticed. I have been alone for some time. I do not know how to want company in the usual way, but I am told it is unwise to continue as I have been. He did not say who had told him. Amos was in the ground. He mailed it on a Friday, rode down to Millfield, handed it to the postmaster without making eye contact, bought salt and lamp wicks, and rode back before noon. The settlement of Millfield sat at the junction where the lowland farms met the foothills that climbed toward Orc territory. Perhaps 200 people if you counted generously. A general store, a blacksmith, a feed supplier, a tavern called Grogan's, a church that served also as a schoolhouse, and a sheriff's office that was sometimes also a bedroom. It was not a beautiful town. It was a useful one, which in that country was considered a higher compliment. The people of Millfield knew Harlan the way small settlements know anyone who has been near but not close for years. They knew his face and his horse and the sound of his boots on the boardwalk when he came down once or twice a month. They knew he didn't stop to talk. They knew he paid for what he bought and never ran a tab. They knew he had come from somewhere east and that something had happened before he arrived and that he did not discuss it. They also knew, because the postmaster was not a man who kept interesting information to himself, that Harlan Voss had mailed a letter to the Greenvale Bonding House, and they had drawn their conclusions with the focused enthusiasm of people who did not have enough to think about in winter. By December, half of Millfield had an opinion about what kind of Orc woman would arrive. Sheriff Briggs, who had a methodical mind, said she would be small and nervous, and probably from one of the farming clans south of the Ashenmere border. Dalton, who ran the general store and had an unbroken record of being wrong about everything that didn't involve inventory, said she would be a widow, middle-aged, stout, practical. Young Elias Grogan, the tavern keeper's son, said nothing publicly but privately thought whoever she was going to need someone to explain the situation, and he considered himself well-positioned to provide that service. And old Mrs. Adler, who ran the only boarding house in Millfield and had seen enough of life to have stopped being surprised by most of it, said only that she hoped the woman had good boots and a warm coat, because the valley in February would sort out everything else. The reply from the Greenvale Bonding House arrived 6 weeks later. The house wrote in a careful, neutral hand. They thanked him. They said a candidate had been identified, an Orc woman of 29 years, experienced with physical labor and outdoor life, of sound health and strong character, possessing what they believed to be the fortitude his situation required. Harlan read this paragraph twice. There was a postscript, written in a different hand, not the house's professional script, but something bolder, the strokes heavier, the letters shaped with the particular pressure of someone who writes rarely and means every mark. I have read the gentleman's letter with care. I understand what is offered and what is asked. I am not a woman of small build, as he has specified, and I want him to know this before arrangements are made so the decision is made with full information. I am a practical woman and I dislike surprises. I imagine he may feel the same. Harlan sat with the letter for a long time. The fire moved in the stove. The wind did its work outside. The house had included particulars. Height, 6'2". Build, substantial. Hands, experienced with heavy labor. Former work, clan forge assistance, livestock management, field clearing. 6'2". He thought about the farmhouse door, which he had built himself and which cleared his head by 3 inches. He thought about the narrow stall in the barn where the milk cow stood. He thought about Amos Creighton in the snow. He wrote back the next morning, 4 sentences. The first confirmed he wished to proceed. The second enclosed the fee. The third said her directness had been noted and was considered a point in her favor. The fourth said he would expect her at Millfield no later than February. He mailed it on Friday. He did not tell anyone what it contained, but Sheriff Briggs noticed that Harlan, when he came down for supplies that week, paused in front of Dalton's store window long enough to look at something inside. The something appeared to be a bolt of dark green fabric that would have been of no use to a man who lived alone. Briggs mentioned this to no one, but he updated his private estimate of the situation. The Orc woman arrived on a Thursday in late February on the supply wagon from Ashenmere, because there was no regular coach service, and the Greenvale Bonding House had arranged passage with a merchant caravan heading south. Harlan was in front of Grogan's Tavern, with his horse and a pack mule he had brought for luggage, which told anyone paying attention, and everyone was paying attention, that he had planned for this practically the way he planned for everything. The wagon came in from the north road and slowed as it passed the first buildings, and by the time it reached the center of Millfield, it had gathered a loose collection of people who had found reasons to be in that part of town at that particular hour. The wagon stopped. The driver called out that they had arrived, and then the canvas flap at the back of the wagon moved, and she stepped out. Harlan saw the boots first, heavy, well-made, the boots of a person who walked on rough ground and expected the boots to keep up. Then the legs, long, solid, wrapped in dark leather traveling trousers. Then the rest of her, and the rest of her was considerable. She was 6 feet 2, as the letter had said, and she was built the way certain orc women are built when they have spent their lives doing work that requires the whole body. Broad across the shoulders, thick through the arms, with hands that were visible even from where Harlan stood, as hands that had gripped, lifted, hauled, hammered, and shaped things for the full length of a working life. Her skin was a deep green, darker at the forearms and the bridge of her nose. Her hair was black, pulled back in a single heavy braid that fell between her shoulder blades. Her tusks were prominent, not the modest nubs that the farming clan women tended to have, but the full, curved tusks of a Highland orc, the kind that marked lineage from the mountain clans where the work was harder and the people were built for it. She wore a traveling coat that fit her, which meant it had been made for her dimensions, which meant she had either found a tailor who understood orc builds, or she had made it herself. It was practical. It was not decorative. She stepped down from the wagon, and her boots found the frozen ground solidly, and she straightened to her full height in a way that was not a performance but simply the natural result of standing up when you are 6 feet 2 and have stopped apologizing for it. The crowd made a sound, a collective intake of breath that was not quite a gasp, but was in the neighborhood. Harlan looked at her. She looked at him, and the looking that happened in that moment was not the looking of romance or attraction, or any of the things that stories use to describe the first meeting of two people who will matter to each other. It was the looking of two people doing calculations. Two people measuring the distance between what they had expected and what was actually standing in front of them. He had asked for small build and quiet disposition. She was neither. She looked at him the way she looked at things, directly, thoroughly, without the performance of social management that softened the assessment. She saw a man of average height, lean, weathered with a face that years of outdoor work makes. She saw hands that were calloused, and a posture that was straight, and a jaw that was set in the way of a man who is processing something and has not yet decided what to do with it. She waited for him to speak first, not from deference, from strategy. She wanted to hear what came out of him before she committed to what would come out of her. He was quiet for a long moment. The crowd was watching. The air was cold. "You filled out the form," he said. "Not for the crowd. For her." "I filled it out completely," she said. Her comment was clear and unhurried, the speech of someone who had learned the language deliberately. Your bonding house chose what to forward. He received this. He looked at her again, a different kind of looking now, less inventory, more something else. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes. The road to the farm is rough, an hour by horse, I was told." He looked at her trunk, which the wagon driver was unloading. It was large. He looked at the pack mule. He looked back at her. "The Greenvale Agency didn't give you what you were told to expect either," she said. He considered this. "No, then we are even." A silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite hostile. The space between two people who have committed to a thing they are not yet sure of. "Dara," she said. "Dara Ironholt. Harlan Voss. I know, your letter was thorough." He turned and went to his horse without another word, not inviting her to follow and not telling her not to, simply moving toward the next thing that needed doing. She looked at the crowd, who were looking at her with the fixed attention of people watching something they would describe later in considerable detail. She looked at young Elias Grogan, who was standing at the edge of things with an expression that was working through several adjustments at once. She picked up her traveling bag and she went to the mule, and she loaded the trunk herself before Harlan could come back to help. Because waiting for help with something she could do was not her instinct, and never had been. Harlan saw this. He saw her lift the trunk, which was not light. and settle it on the pack frame with the practiced economy of someone who had loaded heavier things onto less cooperative animals. He felled it away. They rode out of Millfield in silence. She on the bay mare he had brought. He on his own horse, the pack mule between them. The crowd watched them go. She did not watch the crowd. The road to the farm went north, through flat country that rose gradually toward the foothills, and she rode it the way she seemed to do everything, competently, without performance, reading the ground ahead with the attention of someone who had spent years on worse roads than this. Halfway to the farm, he said without preamble, "The chimney draws well on the west side. The east side backs up in strong wind. Open the south window, 3 inches if you see smoke inside." She said, "All right. The lower runs through old mine workings and shouldn't be used. I'll remember. The mare you're on is Nell. She doesn't like sudden noise on the left side. Something happened to her left ear. She doesn't show it until she shows it all at once. I'll be careful on the left." He said nothing more for the rest of the ride. She understood, without needing it explained, that this constituted something. Not conversation, information transfer. The communication of a man who did not do small talk, but who did do the practical work of making sure the person entering his world had what she needed to survive in it. The farmhouse appeared through the trees as the afternoon light was going long and gold. It was solid, well built, larger than she had expected. The house of a man who had built for permanence, not convenience. Smoke came from the chimney in a straight line, which meant the fire was managed and the draw was working. She noticed this. They dismounted and unloaded in the wordless cooperation of 2 people who were both physically capable and did not need to narrate their actions. He held the door. She went in. Inside was what she had constructed in her mind from his letter and the agency's description. Functional, undecorated, clean. A main room with a fireplace on the north wall and a wood stove in the corner. A table that could seat 4 but had only 1 chair pulled out. Bookshelves above the fireplace. Full. A cooking area organized with the economy of long habit. On the east wall, between 2 windows, a strip of faded blue cloth hung from a nail. It was the only thing in the room that served no function she could identify. She looked at it for 2 seconds and looked away. He showed her the room in back, small, with a window facing west and a bed that was narrow, narrower than she needed, built for someone whose dimensions he had imagined differently. He stood in the doorway. "It's small," he said. She said, "It will do." He said, "I can extend the frame, if you need the length." She turned and looked at him. His face was the same as it had been, not readable, but not closed, offering the information the way he offered everything, as a practical fact. "That would be helpful," she said. He nodded. He went to deal with the horses. She stood in the small room with her trunk at the foot of the too-short bed and listened to the sounds of a farm she had never seen settling into evening around her. The horses in the barn, the fire in the other room, the particular quality of silence that was not silence but the absence of everything she was used to, replaced by wind and distance and the enormous quiet of a valley that did not care whether she was ready for it. She thought, "Well, here I am then." She unpacked what needed unpacking and left the rest for morning. She went out and found he had put food on the table: stew, venison, root vegetables. 2 bowls, 2 spoons, laid out with the careful exactness of a man who had been setting the table for 1 for 7 years, and who had to think deliberately about the mechanics of 2. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, as data, as evidence, as a piece of information about a man who had prepared for her, practically even though what arrived was not what he had prepared for. They ate. He did not talk. She did not talk. The fire moved in the stove. The wind went about its work outside. It was a beginning. Whether it was the beginning of something or only the beginning of a long, difficult winter with a stranger, she did not yet know. But the stew was good, and the second bowl was there, and the man across the table was not looking at her the way most humans looked at orc women, with suspicion or fascination, or the particular discomfort that came from not knowing which category to file her in. He was looking at her the way he looked at his land, with the steady, patient attention of a man who intended to understand what was in front of him before he decided anything about it. She ate all of it. The first morning she woke before he did. The farmhouse was cold in the way that well-built houses are cold before dawn, not the drafty cold of poor construction, but the settled, patient cold of stone and timber that has been sitting in the dark without the fire's company. She dressed in the dark, which was something she was practiced at from years of early mornings at the clan forge, and went out to the main room and found the stove and got the fire going from the banked coals. By the time Harlan appeared from his end of the house, the stove had been burning for 20 minutes, and water was heated for coffee. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, then at her, then at the stove. "I couldn't find where you keep the coffee," she said. He crossed to the shelf above the cooking area and brought down a tin and set it on the table without comment. They had coffee. He was not a man who talked in the morning. She determined this within the first 10 minutes, and found she did not object. She was not much of a morning talker either. The clan forge had been a loud place, the constant ring of hammers and the hiss of quenching and the voices of workers calling over the noise. But she had never been fully inside that current. She had always been slightly to the side of it, contributing when she had something to contribute, and otherwise working. He was out the door before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She heard him in the barn. The methodical sounds of a man attending to horses. She cleared the coffee things and looked at the room and made assessments. She found where he kept everything. She learned the root cellar's organization: dried goods on one side, preserved on the other, root vegetables in the center bins. He was not running short of anything. He was, by any measure, better provisioned than most households she had known in the border settlements. She found the broom and swept the floor, which was already clean, but which she swept anyway, because there is a kind of contact that sweeping makes with a space that is useful when the space is new. She looked at the east wall with a strip of faded blue cloth. She did not touch it. She found what she needed for the noon meal and made it. He came in at midday with the look of a man who had done 4 hours of work and was not particularly thinking about food, but had come in because noon was when a person came in. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He sat and ate with steady attention. He said, halfway through, "The upper creek is running fast. Snowmelt started early on the north face. It changes the drainage on the east pasture." She said, "Does that happen often?" He said, "When the pack is heavier than expected. The north face holds more than the south. It releases in surges." She said, "How can you tell the pack is heavier?" He looked up from his plate, determining whether the question was real or social. Apparently he determined correctly, because he said, "The angle of the drifts on the ridge faces, and the way sound carries in the morning. Heavy snow absorbs differently than light pack." She said, "I would not have known that." He said, "Why would you?" It was not unkind. It was accurate. She said, "I would like to learn it." He ate. He said nothing for a while. Then, "Some of it cannot be learned quickly." She said, "I didn't say quickly." He looked at her again, the same quality of attention. Then he went back to his plate. That afternoon she found the 2 places where the roof leaked. She found them not by climbing up, but by standing in the main room and looking at the ceiling planks, identifying the faint discoloration of repeated wetting and drying over multiple seasons, something she had learned to read at the forge, where the condition of wood was essential knowledge. The 2 spots corresponded with a corner section and a midpoint, telling her something about the roof structure and where stress accumulated. She went outside and looked at the roof from the ground. Then she went to the barn and found the short ladder and the cedar shingles he kept in the back corner. There because he knew about the leaks and hadn't gotten to them. She took the ladder, the shingles, and the nails from the tin on the workbench and went up. She was finishing the first repair when she heard him come out of the tree line. He stopped. "Get down," he said. "The first one is done," she said without stopping. "The second is at the midpoint. The flashing has lifted away from the frame. Get down right now." She finished the nail she was driving. Then she came down, not because he told her to, but because she'd intended to come down anyway, and she wasn't going to misrepresent that. She descended and looked at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do yet, the active suppression of something that wanted to come out. A man who had prepared several things to say and was trying to determine which one was appropriate for a person standing on a roof without permission. "You could have come through," he said finally. "The boards are sound. I tested each one. You tested them from underneath, not from above." under load. I know the difference between a load-bearing plank and a decorative one. I have worked with wood and iron for 14 years. This is not a forge. The principles of structural integrity are the same. He stood there with the particular stillness of a man who has had an argument taken away from him before he was finished with it. She said, "I didn't go up there to prove anything. I went up there because it needs doing, and I could see how to do it." He said after a moment, "I know it needs doing." She said, "I know you know." They looked at each other in the cold afternoon light, with the unfinished roof between them. He said finally, "Tomorrow morning, I'll do the second one." She picked up the shingles and the nails and put them back in the barn where she'd found them. She said, "All right." That night, he sawed an extension piece for the bed frame, without being asked again, working in the barn by lamplight after the dishes were done. She heard the saw going in the quiet. She understood something. Not everything, but something about the way he moved through the world, by the adjustment of physical things to physical needs. She lay in the lengthened bed and listened to the saw and thought, we are two people trying to figure out if this is possible. The second day, he came in from checking on the livestock and said, "There's a ewe down at the Adler place, the east pasture. She's been down since yesterday morning. They think the cold got into her lungs. Old Mrs. Adler is asking if anyone knows anything." She said, "What are the symptoms?" She said, "I grew up tending clan livestock in the Highlands, before the forge." He said, "She's lying on her right side. Breathing is labored, not eating for 2 days." She said, "Bloat, most likely. If she's been grazing on the lower pasture, the wet grass on south-facing slopes causes it when the temperature swings the way it has been. The animal needs to be positioned on her sternum if possible, and walked. If she can't walk, they need to release the gas from the rumen. Has she been treated?" Harlan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him. She said, "It may be too late if it's been 2 days, but those are the steps." He went out. He came back in the evening and said without preamble, "She's standing. Mrs. Adler says, 'Thank you,'" she said. "I'm glad." He sat down and ate his supper. Halfway through, he said into the space above his plate rather than directly to her, "Where else did you work besides the forge and the livestock?" She said, "My aunt ran a tannery in the border settlement at Ashenmere. I worked there 2 summers. Before the forge, I cleared land for the clan expansion. 3 seasons of cutting, hauling, grading. Before that, I tended the war chief's horses from the time I was 12. He said, "How old were you when you left the Highlands?" She said, 19. "My mother died the winter before. There was passage south available, and my mother's sister was in Ashenmere, so I went." He ate. She said, "I have been working since I was 12 years old." He said, "I know that kind of life." She said, "I thought you might. If this story is getting to you, take a second. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think of these 2 so far. And check out more stories right here on Orkthorn Chronicles. Now, back to the farm. The 4th day, she overheard him talking to his horse in the barn. She was crossing the yard with the water bucket, and the barn door was open and his voice came out low and unhurried, something about the weather changing, and the upper trail being icy, and the need to be careful. He was talking to the horse the way some people talk to animals when they are alone, with more ease than they talk to people. She kept walking and continued to the well. The 5th day, she made too much porridge, not from carelessness, but because she was still calibrating quantities for 2 instead of 1. She left the surplus on the stove. He came in, looked at the pot, and ate a second portion without comment. She adjusted her estimates going forward. That evening, alone in her room, she thought about the second portion of porridge eaten without comment, about the way Harlan had looked at the pot, calculated and simply eaten. No remark about the quantity, no observation about waste, no indication that the surplus had been noticed as anything other than food that was there. It was a small thing, but small things were the things Dura had learned to measure her world by, because the large things, the obvious ones, the ones other people noticed, had never been the problem. The problem had always been the small things. The pause before a handshake that lasted a fraction too long. The way Orc men in the border settlements looked at her, and then looked away, not with disinterest, but with the particular recalibration of a man adjusting his expectations downward. The way her aunt in Ashenmere had introduced her to the tanner's son. A good match, everyone said. A strong orc from a working family. And the tanner's son had sat across from her at the table and talked pleasantly for an hour, and then told his mother afterward that Dura was impressive, but not the kind of woman he pictured beside him. Not the kind of woman he pictured. The phrase had reached her through her aunt, who delivered it with the compressed expression of a woman passing along something she wished she didn't have to pass along. Dura had received it standing in the tannery yard with her hands still smelling of the hides she had been curing, and she had thought with great clarity. So that is the word for it. She was too tall, too broad, too strong. Her tusks were too prominent, the Highland kind, not the modest farming clan kind that orc men in the lowlands preferred. Her hands were too capable, too visibly marked by the forge and the field and the years of work that had shaped them into instruments of function rather than decoration. She was not ugly. She knew she was not ugly, but she was not the kind of woman an orc man pictured when he pictured a wife. The kind they pictured was smaller, softer, with modest tusks and hands that hadn't hauled timber. That had been 4 years ago. She had not tried again. She had gone back to the forge and the livestock and the field clearing, and she had built a life that did not require anyone to picture her as anything. And the life had been functional and solitary and sufficient in the way that sufficient things are. Present, but not full. The Greenvale notice had appeared on a board in Ashemere's Market Square, between an advertisement for a farrier and a notice about stolen goats. She had read it twice, and folded it and carried it for 5 weeks before writing. When she wrote, she did not try to make herself sound smaller or softer or more like the kind of woman anyone pictured. She wrote what she was. She had decided, somewhere in the vicinity of a tannery yard 4 years ago, standing with hide-scented hands, that she was done managing other people's comfort about what she was. The postscript had been her idea, her condition before any arrangement moved forward. The man needed to know in plain language that she was not what he had described, not as an apology, as information, so that whatever happened next was happening with both eyes open. His third sentence had stayed with her. Her directness had been noted and was considered a point in her favor, not forgiven, not overlooked, noted and considered a point in her favor. She had looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she had agreed to come. The 6th day he found her behind the barn splitting wood. She had found the maul and the splitting block that morning, assessed the woodpile. Substantial but not sufficient for the remaining winter at the rate both stoves consumed, and decided the sensible thing was to add to it during the afternoon hours. When the indoor work was done, she was not trying to make a point. She was splitting wood, because wood needed splitting. He came around the corner and stopped. She brought the maul down and the round split cleanly. She moved the halves, set the next one, split it. He watched for a moment. She said, "The pile by the south wall is getting short. I thought I'd work on the rounds from the fall cutting." He said, "Those are the rounds I was going to split this week." She said, "I can stop." He said, "No." She split another round. He said, "You've done this before." She said, "My aunt's tannery had 6 hearths." He said, and she could not entirely read the tone, "Is there anything you haven't done?" She thought about it seriously. "I haven't sheared a sheep." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a skill that takes time." She said, "I assumed." She split another round. He went into the barn. She thought she might have heard something from inside the barn that was not the horses and was not words, but was something, the small, compressed sound of a man who has been surprised by something and has not yet decided whether to call the surprise good or simply unexpected. She did not stop splitting to investigate. The 7th day she found the blue cloth's meaning, or part of it. She had not asked, she had been looking at it every day from the corner of her eye, noting the way it didn't belong with the cabin's logic, the way it sat on the east wall like a piece of punctuation in a text where it had no grammatical function. She had built theories and discarded them. She was at the table, mending a pair of his work socks. He was at the other end, cleaning his rifle. They were in the working silence they had been arriving at by degrees. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who do not need words to feel the other person's presence. He said abruptly, "She put it there." She said, "I know." He said after a pause, "You've been looking at it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Lorna." She said, "I thought so." He said. She said the house needed something that wasn't useful. She couldn't abide a place with only useful things. She said it made her feel like livestock. She thought about a woman who had lived in this house and found it insufficient and had hung a piece of fabric on the wall as a statement of something she needed that the place did not provide. She said, "What did you think when she said that?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I thought she was wrong. I thought if everything was useful, you wouldn't waste time on things that weren't," she said. "And now?" He said more slowly, "Now, I think we were talking about different things. And neither of us understood it at the time." She said nothing. She went back to the sock. He said, "I left it there because taking it down felt like erasing something I didn't want to erase, even after she left." She said, "I understand that." He said, "Do you?" She said, "When my mother died, she had a piece of green glass, a bottle, nothing special, on the window ledge in our kitchen. It wasn't useful. It was only there because the light came through it in the afternoon and she liked the color it made on the wall. When I left the Highlands, I couldn't take it. I thought about that bottle for 10 years. He set down the rifle and looked at her, not the assessing look. "Something less guarded," she said. "The cloth doesn't bother me. You should know that." He said, "I didn't know how to ask without it being a large question." She said, "It is not a large question. It is only a cloth." He picked up the rifle. She sewed the sock. The fire made its sounds, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, in fact, almost the opposite. The storm arrived on a Monday before dawn, not the passing kind, the kind that had been building over the northern ranges for 3 days, and arrived with the settled authority of weather that had decided what it was going to do and was not interested in discussion. She heard it before she was fully awake, the change in the quality of the silence outside, no longer the clear, cold stillness of a calm night, but the muffled, pressurized silence of a world being covered. She rose, went to the window, saw nothing but white coming down in the dark, and went to the stove and rebuilt the fire. She had done this every morning for 7 days now with enough consistency that the process had stopped requiring thought and had entered the category of things the hands know. He was up 20 minutes later, earlier than usual, which meant he'd heard the storm too and had made the same calculation she had. Animals first, everything else after. He came through from his end of the house, stopped when he saw the stove already going, looked at it, looked at her, got his coat, and went to the barn. She made breakfast. By the time they had eaten, the snow was coming down with the steadiness of a storm that intended to stay. He brought in 4 loads of wood from the lean-to, stacking it along the north wall in methodical rows. She watched the size of the stack and revised her estimate. 3 days, she said down the 4th load. At least. What needs doing outside that can't wait? Horses are fine. Ice is broken on the trough. Feed for 4 days. Trap lines will have to wait. Then we are inside. 2 people who have been in this house for 1 week and who are now going to be in it together for 3 more days without the relief of either going outside for any extended period. She thought, this is the kind of thing that either works or doesn't. She got out the mending basket. He got out a length of rawhide he was working into a new set of reins. They worked. The snow came down outside with complete indifference to their situation. The first day of the storm was quiet in the way of 2 people who were still mostly strangers and who have not yet worked out how to be in a confined space together for a long time. There was a low awareness of the other person that was not uncomfortable but required management, the way new furniture in a familiar room requires adjusting the paths you've always walked without thinking. She read in the afternoon, he read in the evening. They did not read the same thing at the same time. That would have felt like an intimacy they had not arrived at. But they occupied the same room with their separate books and the fire and the sound of the storm, and this was its own kind of thing, its own category of arrangement that was different from being alone, and different from the performance of being with people. He cooked the evening meal. This surprised her, not because she'd thought he couldn't, but because she'd assumed the division of labor had settled into a pattern from the first week. He made venison stew with dried beans and root vegetables, and it was good, better than she'd expected from a man who'd been cooking for himself for 7 years, which spoke to a standard he maintained even in the absence of anyone to maintain it for. She said, "This is well made." He said, "Amos Creighton taught me. He was a better cook than most gave him credit for." She said, "You've mentioned him. He died last year." He said, "Late October, caught in the storm on the North Ridge." He'd been checking my upper trapline as a favor, because I'd been sick the week before. He said this without the inflection that invites inquiry, but also without the inflection that closes a subject, which she was coming to understand was his approach to difficult things, stating them plainly and leaving the door open or closed, depending on something she hadn't yet identified. She said, "He was checking your line when it happened." He said, "Yes?" They ate. The storm pressed against the walls. She said after a while, "Did he know that it was your line? Did Amos know the last thing he did was a favor for you?" Harlan set down his spoon, looked at the table for a long moment. "I've thought about that," he said. "And?" He said, "I think he knew. Amos always knew what he was doing, and why he was that kind of man." She said, "Then he died doing something he chose for someone he wanted to do it for. That is not the worst thing." He looked at her with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his version of being genuinely moved. Not visible the way it would be on most faces, but present in the stillness, in the particular quality of the pause before he spoke. He said, "No, it is not the worst thing." They finished. She cleared the table. He went to the south window and looked at the weather, which told him something she couldn't read. Then he put more wood on the stove, and they settled into the evening routine. His work and her book, the fire between them. Before he went to bed, he said without looking up from the rawhide, "He told me I'd die alone on this farm, 3 days before anyone knew." She said, "Amos did." He said, "Yes, he generally did." She sat by the fire and thought about a man she had never met who had told the truth to his friend and died doing a kindness, and who had left behind, in the shape of his absence, the letter that had brought her here. She thought, "Amos Creighton, I owe you something I can never pay." The second day of the storm was different in a way that was difficult to define. Same storm, same cabin, same 2 people. But something about the second day of being confined with a person is different from the first, because the first day you are still managing it consciously, and the second day the management begins to slip, and what comes through is less curated. He was at the table working on the reins when he said, without preamble, "The fabric at the general store, the green wool, what did you end up doing with it?" She looked at him. He said, still not looking up, "I saw you look at it through the window when you came in for supplies your second day. Dalton's window." She said, "I didn't buy it. I was looking at the weight, the nap. I thought it might work for a vest, warm enough for outdoor work without the bulk of a full coat." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Dalton carries a good medium weight. The heavier stuff is more than you need, unless you're outside all day." She said, "That was my assessment." He said, "Elias Grogan runs the monthly supply up from town. You can send a note down if you want something." She said, "I'll think about it." She went back to her book, but something had shifted in the room. A door someone had put their hand on without yet pushing through. She had been thinking about Elias Grogan intermittently since the first day, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention she gave to things that contained more than they showed. He was a young man with an easy manner and useful knowledge of the valley, and he had made it apparent at the wagon and again at the street that he considered her situation on this farm somewhat concerning, and himself possibly relevant to improving it. She said after a while, "What do you know about the Grogan family?" Harlan said, "Old Grogan has run the tavern for 20 years. Elias was born here. His mother died when he was 13. He's run his father's supply route since he was 16. She said, He is that kind of person." She said, "Is he trustworthy?" Harlan looked up. The steady, measuring look. He said, "Trustworthy how?" She said, "In general, as a person." He said, "He is not dishonest. He is young, and hasn't had enough happen to him yet to know the weight of things. She said, "That's a careful answer." He said, "It's an accurate one." She said, "Does it bother you that he speaks to me?" The question landed with more clarity than she had entirely intended. She had meant it as practical inquiry, but heard when it was out that it was also more than that. He set the rawhide down. He said after a moment that was long enough to be honest and short enough not to be evasive. "Yes," she said. "Why?" He said, "I don't know what his intentions are, and I'm not in a position to ask, and I don't like things I can't read." She said, "You could ask me." He said, "I am asking you now, indirectly." She said, "His intentions are his problem. Mine are what you should be concerned with." He said, "What are yours?" She said, "I am here. I chose to be here. I am not in the habit of choosing things and then reconsidering them every time something adjacent presents itself." He looked at her for a long moment, not the assessing look and not the guarded look, something between those and something else. He said, "I understand that. I haven't always behaved in ways consistent with understanding it." She said, "No, but you are not doing badly at the moment." He picked up the rawhide. She picked up her book. The storm continued outside without investment in the human arrangements inside the walls. If you're still with us, you're part of this. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments whether you think Harlan deserves her. More stories on Orkthorn Chronicles. Now, back to the farm. The third day, the snow stopped in mid-afternoon, and the sky cleared, going from white and closed to a blue so sharp it seemed aggressive. The light that came through the windows was the light of a world remade overnight. All the reference points softened, under white distances changed. She stood at the south window. He came to stand near, not beside, but near. They looked at the altered landscape in the way people look at things that are genuinely beautiful, without feeling the need to narrate the beauty. He said, "Upper Trail will be impassable for 2 days, maybe 3. She said, "And then?" He said, "Traps need checking, more to do than usual for a while." She said, "I know you can." She said, "You've been deciding how to feel about that." He said, "Yes." She said, "Have you decided?" He was quiet. Outside, the light was doing something extraordinary on the fresh snow, catching ice crystals in the top layer, making the surface appear lit from within. He said, "My father believed the measure of a man was what he could do for himself and for the people in his care. That needing help with the physical work of his life was a diminishment." "Ah," she said, "and you believe that?" He said slowly, "I believed it for a long time because I hadn't considered whether I believed it or had simply inherited it without examination." "There is a difference." She said, "There is." He said, "I'm examining it now. It's taking longer than I'd prefer." She turned and looked at him, because this was the most he had said at one time about the inside of himself, and she wanted to see his face while he said it. His face was its usual face, but there was something in it that had not been there the first day or the second or any day in the first week. The quality of a person saying the true thing out loud for the first time and finding that it does not kill them. She said, "Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." He said, "I know. That is part of what makes it possible to examine." They stood at the window a little longer. Then she went to start the evening meal, and he went to get more wood, which was something to do that was not the conversation they had just had. 3 days after the storm, on a Sunday, she came around the corner of the barn in late morning and found him standing absolutely still at the edge of the tree line. She stopped without sound, looked where he was looking. A lone wolf stood at the edge of the clearing 40 yards out, old, gray-muzzled, standing the way wild things stand when they have noticed something, but haven't decided if the something is a threat. The wolf was looking directly at Harlan. She stayed still for a full minute. Nothing moved. Then the wolf dropped its head and moved away into the trees, unhurried, as though the conclusion it had reached was that this particular human was not currently relevant. Harlan stood a moment longer, turned, and saw her at the corner of the barn. He said nothing. She said, "How long has it been coming to this edge?" He said, "Since autumn, 3 or 4 times a week." She said, "You haven't hunted it." He said. No, she said. Why? He looked at the tree line. Amos spotted it first, last spring. He said it was too good a thing to shoot. She said, Do you agree? He said after a moment. It's always alone. The packs range further north. This one doesn't run with them. She looked at the empty tree line. She said, Hello, wolf. She said it quietly, to the place where the animal had been, not expecting a response, only acknowledging what had been there. He said, You are a strange woman. She said, I know. He said, I did not mean it as a criticism. She said, I know that too. They went back to their separate work, but something had passed between them. That was the acknowledgement that there were things on this farm that mattered to him beyond the practical, and she had seen one and treated it correctly, and had called her strange out loud, not to diminish it, but because the word was the right word. And he was a man who used the right word, even when it cost him something. The following Tuesday, she was in the root cellar doing inventory when she heard him come in. The particular sound of his boots on the floor above, and then a different sound. A chair moving, the sound of a man sitting down heavily in a way that was not his habitual way. She came up. He was at the table, coat still on, hat on the table instead of the hook, looking at his hands. What happened? She said. Nothing. Nothing happened. You're sitting with your coat on, looking at your hands. He said, I found the lower trap line. One of the traps had something in it that wasn't meant to be caught. A dog, someone's dog. Young, brown, with one white ear. She waited. I don't know how it got that far from town. She said nothing. She went to the stove, poured coffee, put it in front of him. She sat down across the table. He said, I know it's only a dog. It's not a significant thing, she said. It's significant enough that you came in and sat down with your coat on. He said, I don't like finding things in traps that have no business being in traps. She said, No, I wouldn't either. He said, the trap was right location, right set. I did nothing wrong. She said, No, it doesn't. He drank the coffee. She sat across from him and did not try to resolve the thing, or minimize it, or redirect him toward practical steps. She sat there, which was its own form of presence, the form that says, This is real, and I'm not going to pretend it's less than it is. After a while, he took his coat off and hung it on the hook. She said, Did you move the trap? He said, Relocated the whole lower line further east. She said, That's the right thing. He said, Yes. He went and got his book from the shelf above the fireplace, the one she had noticed on the second day. Set slightly back from the others, the spine cracked and repaired. He sat at the table and read. She did not look at what page he opened to, but she could see from where she sat that it was near the back, and the corner was folded down. She thought about a man who read poetry alone on a farm and didn't tell anyone, who had a dead friend who named a wolf, who came inside and sat heavily at a table because a young dog with one white ear had been in a trap. She thought, I would like to know this person, all of this person. I think it's going to take a long time. I think a long time is what I have. She mended the sock she was working on and listened to the fire and said nothing. Neither did he, and it was the best evening they'd had, which was a strange thing to think about, an evening that started with a dog in a trap, but which was true, because the best evenings are not always the ones where nothing hard is present, but sometimes the ones where the hard thing is present and is not being refused. The lamp burned down at its own pace. Outside, the valley was what it always was, large and cold and older than anything either of them had lived through, going about its seasons without consulting anyone. The valley was not finished watching yet. Elias Grogan came up the valley road on a Thursday 6 days after the storm. The first day, the road was fully passable. He came with a supply horse and the monthly list Harlan had sent down before the weather turned, and he came with the particular alertness of a young man who had been thinking about something for 2 weeks and was trying to appear as though this were routine. She saw him coming through the trees from the kitchen window. She finished what she was doing and went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch, because waiting for things to arrive at her was not her instinct. He pulled up his horse and smiled, the good, easy smile. You survived the storm, then? We did. Come up. I'll get you coffee while you unload. He came to the porch and she poured from the pot on the stove. He stood at the kitchen end of the room and looked around with the assessment of a person trying to determine the condition of a situation without appearing to do so. Place looks well kept, he said. It was well kept when I arrived. I've maintained the standard. Is he treating you fairly, Harlan? Yes. He can be hard. He's been alone a long time, and alone can become a habit that makes a person difficult. She said, Mr. Grogan, you've been kind and I appreciate it, but I want to be clear about something. I am not a situation that needs managing from the outside. I am a woman who made a decision and who is living with it. If I had concerns, I am capable of expressing them to the appropriate person, which would be Harlan, or if it came to that, Sheriff Briggs, it would not be you. He held the coffee cup in both hands. His expression moved through several things: surprise, something not quite hurt, something closer to respect than either. I didn't mean to imply you couldn't handle yourself, he said. I know you meant to help. It's a good impulse, but it's aimed at the wrong target. He's lucky then, if that's how you see it. I don't know yet if luck is the right word. Ask me in the spring. He almost smiled. She did smile briefly because she had no ill will toward Elias Grogan, and the conversation was going where it needed to go. He unloaded the supply horse with the efficiency of long practice. Harlan came in from the east pasture and took stock of what had arrived. Road passable? Harlan said. West track. Drifts are still deep on the east switchback. The west track is slower, but passable. The exchange contained a significant amount of information, packed into very few words. The shorthand of men who had known each other in a particular way for years, not as friends, as people whose lives occupied adjacent territory. At the door, Elias paused. The social at Millfield Church is the second Saturday of next month. If either of you has a mind to come down, Mrs. Briggs organizes it. She said, "Thank you for letting us know." Elias rode back down the valley. She watched him go from the window, then turned back to the meal. Harlan was at the table, comparing the supply list to what had arrived. "What did he want?" he said without looking up. "To check on me, and to see what was here to see." And I told him I was not a situation requiring management from outside. He looked up. She felt the look rather than saw it. What did he say? He took it well. He's a decent young man who hasn't learned that decent impulses aren't always relevant. He went back to the list. Salt is 2 pounds short. I noticed. I'll note it for next month. The letter arrived 2 days later, brought by the mailboy who left it on the porch railing as always. It was from someone she had not expected. The clan elder's wife from the Ashenmere border settlement, a woman named Dirtha who had known her mother and who kept track of Highland Orc women the way old women keep track of things they consider their responsibility. Dirtha wrote the way old women wrote, in long loops that circled the point several times before arriving. She wrote that she hoped the human was feeding her properly. She wrote that the forge at Ashenmere had closed, which meant her timing in leaving had been, as Dirtha put it, not the worst decision you ever made, though the competition for that title remains open. She wrote that she missed her, which she said less often than she meant. She wrote near the end, "Your mother would have wanted to know if you were warm and if the man had sense. I cannot ask her, so I am asking you. Write back and tell me the truth, not the version you think an old woman wants to hear." She read this paragraph twice. She thought about her mother, who had died in the Highlands, with a green glass bottle on the window ledge. And who had believed that you could read a person's character from the way they treated the things they didn't need to treat well, the animals, the land, the objects in the house that served no function except to catch the light. But just when one day after, I watched imaginary water cattle running onto me and found it outside inside the stationary part of the middle of the wrap. The town of the fenceport rode no function except to catch the light. She wrote back that evening. She told Dirtha the farm was solid and the man had sense, though the sense was buried under 7 years of silence and required patience to excavate. She told her the valley was what she had expected, and more than she had expected in ways she couldn't easily describe in a letter. She told her she was not yet sure of everything, but she was sure of the important thing, that she had been right to come. She sealed the letter and put it on the shelf by the door. She lay in the dark, and thought about being right to come. She thought about the specific inventory of the weeks that had passed. The roof, the ewe, the woodpile, the storm, the conversation at the window about examining inherited beliefs. She thought about Dirtha's question, and her own answer, and whether the answer was complete. It was not complete. The complete answer would have included things she was not yet ready to write to an old woman in a border settlement. Things about the way a man's silence could become a kind of warmth when you stopped trying to fill it. About the way a bed frame extended, without being asked twice, said more than most men managed to say in a year of talking. About the way she had stopped calculating whether this was possible and had started simply living as though it was. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, most of it. The weeks moved. The snow thinned on the south-facing slopes first, then on the flat, then in the shadows beneath the trees where it held longest. The creek rose. The ground softened. The first green appeared along the fence line. Not much, just a thread of color in the brown, but enough to see if you were paying attention. He was, too, though he showed it differently. He showed it by opening the barn door wider in the mornings to let the new warmth in, by standing on the porch a minute longer before going to work, by the particular way he looked at the east pasture when the light hit it in the late afternoon, the look of a man seeing his land come back to life and being quietly grateful for it. She found herself adjusting, too, not just to the season, but to something underneath the season, the slow shift in the way they moved around each other, which had been careful at first and was now something else. Not careless, never careless, neither of them were careless people, but easier. The paths they walked in the house had stopped requiring negotiation. She knew where she would be, and the knowing had become a kind of comfort that neither of them named, because naming it would require acknowledging that it mattered, and acknowledging that it mattered would require acknowledging what it would mean if it stopped. One morning in early April, she washed her clothes and hung them on the line behind the house. She had been doing this since the weather allowed. Her shirts, her work trousers, the heavy apron she wore when splitting wood. They hung in the particular order she always used, largest to smallest, spaced evenly the way her mother had done it, because her mother believed that even laundry deserved the dignity of being done properly. She went inside to start the noon meal. When she came back out an hour later to check the drying, there was a shirt on the line that had not been there before. His shirt, a brown work shirt, heavy cotton, hung on the line beside her green one, not at the end of the line where there was more room. Beside hers, close enough that the sleeves touched when the wind moved them. She stood and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. She understood, without needing it explained, without needing to ask, that a man who had been hanging his laundry alone for 7 years had just hung his shirt next to hers, and that he had done it without thinking, which was the point. The things you do without thinking are the things that tell you who you are becoming. She did not move the shirt. She did not rearrange the line. She went back inside, and the afternoon continued. And neither of them said a word about it. But from that day, the shirts hung together. Every wash day, green beside brown, the sleeves touching when the wind came through. She did not ask him about it. He did not explain. There are conversations that happen between two people without any words being spoken. And those conversations are sometimes more honest than the ones that use words, because words can be curated and managed and softened, but the place where you hang your shirt is the place where you hang your shirt. The evening of the first truly warm day, warm enough to sit outside, warm enough that the air carried the smell of thawed earth and new grass and the particular sweetness of a valley, waking up, they sat on the porch together, not by arrangement. She had gone out because the evening was beautiful. He had come out because she was there, though he would not have said it that way. They sat on the 2 sections of log that served as seats, with the valley laid out in front of them in the late gold light, the creek catching the sun like a thread of fire, the tree line dark against the sky. He said, "Amos told me once that the measure of a life wasn't what you built or what you kept. It was whether someone noticed when you stopped being there." She said, "Smart man. I didn't always listen well enough." She said, "You listened well enough to write a letter." He was quiet for a long time. The light was changing, moving from gold to amber, the shadows lengthening across the yard, the barn going dark on one side while the other held the last of the sun. He said, I asked for small build and quiet disposition. She said, I know. He said, I was wrong about what I needed. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, which was how he said the truest things, aimed at the horizon, as if the words needed the open space to land in. She said, What do you need? He said very slowly, as though each word was being tested before it was spoken. Someone who goes up on a roof without asking, who tells a used bloat from a kitchen table, who splits wood I was going to split and doesn't apologize for it, who sits across from me when a dog is in a trap and doesn't try to fix it, who says hello to a wolf. He paused. Who hung her shirt on the line and didn't move it when mine showed up beside it. She felt something move through her chest, not the sharp crack of a sudden thing, but the slow, deep shift of ground that has been settling for weeks and has finally found its new position. She said, That is the most you have ever said at one time. He said, Yes, it cost me something. She said, I know. I could hear it. They sat on the porch. The light went from amber to copper. The first stars appeared above the eastern ridge. The wolf, if it was out there, was somewhere in the tree line, doing what wolves do at dusk, watching the open ground with old gold eyes and making its own calculations about the things that lived there. She reached across the space between the two log seats and put her hand on his, green on brown, rough on rough, the hand of a woman who had been working since she was 12, and the hand of a man who had been building since he was younger than that. His fingers closed around hers. Not fast, the way a man holds something he has decided to hold and is still adjusting to the weight of the decision. They sat like that while the dark came in. They did not go inside for a long time. The valley settled into night around them, and the fire inside the house burned down to coals, and the shirts on the line behind the house, green and brown side by side, sleeves touching, went still as the wind died. She had come here because a bonding house in Ashenmere had matched a letter from a man who wanted small with a woman who was not. She had come because Boston? No, because the border settlements, because the Highlands, because every place she had been had stopped being a place where she could find out what was possible. She had come to find out. She had found out. Not all of it. Not yet. The valley would have more to say. More storms, more seasons, more mornings where the light did something extraordinary on the snow, and two people stood at a window and watched it without narrating the beauty. More shirts on the line, more evenings on the porch, more conversations that happened without words and were more honest than the ones that used them. But the part that mattered, the part that had been waiting underneath everything since a letter sat on a table for 4 days before a man decided to mail it, that part was here, on a porch, in the dark, in two hands that had found each other across a space that was not large but that had taken a very long time to cross. The valley watched. It was not finished watching, but it had seen enough, for now, to know that what was growing here was the kind of thing that held.